So a while back, I released what I called an advanced lecture, where I really talked in detail about how I believe consciousness arises from the kind of archetypal structure of the human mind. And in that video, I pretty much conjectured, without much justification, that the left hemisphere of the brain was closely associated with the animus, and the right hemisphere was very closely associated with the anima. Now, that statement requires some qualification because it's very simple to attempt to kind of assign to the brain various Jungian archetypes. For example, you could say that the shadow arises from the amygdala or something like that. But there's a sense in which this is a bit of an oversimplification because when we talk about archetypes, we're fundamentally talking about psychological objects. We're talking about psychic organs, which is a difficult concept to wrap your mind around, especially when you think about the fact that the brain itself is a physical organ. And so, what we're in effect saying when we make the claim that this brain region is this archetype is saying that this particular brain region gives rise to the archetype. It isn't equivalent to the archetype, but rather its structure and its function gives rise to the psychological experience from the first person perspective. But I don't necessarily think that a single brain region can account for any particular archetype. It seems to me that the psychological experience and the subjective experience of an archetype arises from the interaction, the highly dynamic interaction of particular modules in the brain. So, for instance, the entire left hemisphere working together and cooperating in a very specific way is what gives rise to the anima. To the animus, sorry. I might mix those two up occasionally, but hopefully I'll have corrections if I ever say animus when I mean anima or the other way around. But essentially what I'm trying to say is that the whole integrated system gives rise to the archetype. And it's not necessarily one brain region gives rise to this archetype. It's rather the interrelation and the connection between various brain regions and them working together in a module that gives rise to the psychological experience, to the subjective feeling of having that archetype and that the presence of that archetype within your psyche. There have been many attempts to link the two hemispheres in particular to various Jungian concepts. For example, Anthony Stevens pointed out that many other psychologists believed that the left hemisphere was consciousness and the right hemisphere was the unconscious. Now, he points out that this is actually a gross oversimplification because there's no way to say that the entire left hemisphere is conscious, especially when you think about the fact that consciousness is such a small part of our mental lives. It would be weird to attribute an entire hemisphere to consciousness. But there is a sense in which this actually makes sense, and we can draw an association between the left hemisphere and consciousness. And it's particularly those higher regions of the left hemisphere, the prefrontal cortex, and also the prefrontal cortex of the right hemisphere is involved in consciousness. If you recall back to that lecture, I actually explained in detail why I believed both hemispheres were fundamentally responsible in the experience of consciousness, but the left hemisphere does play the kind of predominant role, particularly in the formation of the ego and the fact of the feeling of explicitness that consciousness provides. That feeling comes from the left hemisphere. So while it is overly simplistic to say that the left hemisphere is conscious and the right hemisphere is unconscious, especially since there are so many regions of the left hemisphere that are kind of below the threshold of conscious perception, I think that dividing the hemispheres between anima and animus fundamentally encompasses this whole thing about consciousness and the unconscious, but it also is, I think, a lot more fundamental and it essentially asserts that the animus is an unconscious mechanism within our minds, and that unconscious mechanism actually gives rise to consciousness. I just, the origins and history of consciousness, which I have here, is pretty much it's an attempt to explain how consciousness arises from internal psychological archetypes and how they interact to give us consciousness. And the masculine side plays a predominant role, and so masculinity in and of itself is a kind of unconscious function, but that unconscious function rises up to give us our conscious experience. Now, of course, there are a lot of nuances with this subject, and so basically everything I'm saying is an oversimplification. Because, there are always exceptions to rules and there are always particular cases that kind of seem to suggest otherwise from what I'm saying. But I would contend to say that the general pattern isn't broken, barring some exceptions. Leonard Shlain made the argument that the right hemisphere was feminine and the left hemisphere was masculine. And so I'm not the first person to actually assert this. And in fact, a lot of people have made the claim that the right hemisphere is feminine and the left hemisphere is masculine. But others have argued that this is kind of an arbitrary distinction. For example, why would we assign empathy as being a feminine trait? What's that all about? Well, there's actually I think, a fairly consistent way to assign certain psychological traits to the genders. And this has to do with the fundamental psychological differences between men and women. There are, on average, consistent measurable differences between men and women in particular psychological traits. For instance, men on average prefer to work with inanimate objects, whereas women prefer to work with people. Another consistent difference is the fact that women are a lot more emotional. By this, I mean they experience a wider range of emotions, and they're more expressive about their emotions. They're more willing to openly express their emotions, and they feel emotions a lot more powerfully. They're more influenced by their emotions. And that includes negative emotions like guilt, shame, and sadness, but positive emotions like happiness and elation. The one exception is anger, actually, but we'll talk about that in a second. Men, in contrast, are a lot more emotionally neutral and they're less passive, with the exception of anger. Men tend to experience a lot more anger than women, and they're a lot more aggressive than women. I think that's a fairly obvious difference, and in fact, all of us probably implicitly know that. That aggressiveness is actually a key concomitant of masculinity. And like I said before, men demonstrate a higher degree of emotional neutrality. They're able to kind of cut through their emotions, and they're less expressive about their emotions. And because of this lack of emotionality, men tend to be a lot more rational than women. They tend to use the thinking part of their minds a lot more, whereas women are more influenced by their emotions. Men are less likely to be swayed by their emotions and more likely to kind of use their thinking minds when solving problems. Another fairly simple difference is the fact that women tend to be a lot more collectivistic, and men are usually a lot more individualistic. Another important difference is the fact that on average, women express a lot more empathy than men. Now, empathy is actually a very multifaceted concept. It entails not just the ability to see things from another person's perspective, but also to feel the emotions they feel. Women are able to connect with people on an emotional level a lot more seamlessly than men. Now, I guess one of the most interesting things here is the fact that I think we all implicitly know that these are the differences between men and women. Like, none of these differences probably came as a surprise to you because you probably implicitly know that masculinity is associated with certain traits and femininity is associated with other traits. But it goes even deeper than that. It seems that the mind itself is geared to think of the world in terms of masculine and feminine. The idea of masculine and the idea of feminine is an idea which is deeply implanted in the psyche. This is pretty clear when you think about all the languages that have masculine and feminine words. And again, this makes a lot of sense because out there in the real world, and the social world, we have to be able to make the distinction between men and women. Because for me, for instance, as a man, a woman is a fundamentally different object and has a very particular value for me. That's my only way to pass on my progeny to the next generation. And so I have to treat women as fundamentally different objects than how I treat men. And furthermore, I have to identify with one of these genders. So me feeling that kind of masculine presence within myself, I identify with this side, and the feminine side I project outwards onto other people. And of course, you do have people who are born biological males but then identify as females. But of course, that's not really an exception that breaks the rule because all that's happening there is that person is identifying with their feminine side more than with their masculine side. The concept of the feminine within them is the part of themselves which they view as themselves. So of course, there are these unique cases, but again, they don't necessarily contradict the basic patterns. So our minds have an archetypal schema of what a man and a woman are, because it is very important in the actual world to be able to make that distinction and identify things as women or men. So this duality between masculine and feminine is a very natural idea. Now the question becomes, why is it that we implicitly associate certain traits with masculinity and with femininity? And the answer that Jung came up with is the fact that men and women are composed of the contrasexual traits. We possess a contrasexual image of the other gender, and this contrasexual image is typified by all of the characteristics which we normally assign to the other gender. This is to say that as a man, I carry all of the feminine traits within me. It's just that they're less predominant than my masculine traits. So for instance, even though men are on average less empathetic than women, it doesn't mean that men are incapable of empathy. It's just that this function is less developed than the opposite function, which is to not be empathetic and not to be emotional. But men are still capable of emotionality and empathy. Is just that this side of themselves is less developed and less predominant. And equally, a woman isn't incapable of rationality. I know very many rational women. It's just that this side of themselves is generally less developed and less predominant than the emotional side of things. So you can say that the reason I know which traits go with the idea of woman is because I have these traits within me and they're intimately bound with my internal concept of woman. Now, one very key difference between the anima and animus, which Jung pointed out, is that of eros and logos. Eros is fundamentally about connection, whereas logos is about discrimination. By discrimination, I don't mean like racial discrimination or something. I mean more in the sense of differentiation, of dividing the world in into specific categories and into and isolating objects from their kind of background. Eros is also associated with the emotional side of things, and logos is more associated with rationality. And rationality depends on this ability to divide the world and abstract and create an abstract version of the world. And it's also related to the fact that we can, this divide the world and speak about the individual entities of the world as being distinct from each other. Whereas Eros is about connection and seeing connections between things, and the fundamental relatedness between different objects rather than their distinctions. Now, you obviously know where I'm going with this. This difference in and of itself is a difference between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, i.e. our more feminine traits can be roughly aligned with the right hemisphere, and our more masculine traits can be roughly aligned with the left hemisphere. For example, empathy is more closely associated with the right hemisphere, and even our depth of emotionality is a right hemisphere function. The right hemisphere is also a lot more social and better suited for social interactions. It's a lot more friendly, it's a lot better for facilitating cooperation, and is therefore more collectivistic. The left side, by contrast, is a lot more individualistic, and it's competitive rather than cooperative. Ian McGilchrist described there being a drive for individuation in the left hemisphere and a drive for cohesion in the right hemisphere. And this individuation that he talks about is highly associated with the fact of being individualistic rather than cooperative. The left hemisphere is also a lot more interested in inanimate objects rather than people. And that's why it's better with tools, for instance. That's why we use our right hands for tool use. Obviously, there are some exceptions, which is why, again, this subject is so complicated because we always keep finding exceptions, but these exceptions are just cases where the psychology plays out a little differently. The left hemisphere is also much more emotionally neutral, which is why it is more rational. But again, it's also heavily involved with our experiences of anger and aggression. That's actually related to our individualistic drive, because anger is not the emotion of social cooperation. It doesn't facilitate cooperation between people and connection between people. It actually causes there to be divisions between people. When you're angry with somebody, it's an attempt of you to kind of assert your own will rather than cooperate with them. Now, I guess one of the things that I should probably note upon is the fact that the reason our psychological tendencies are compartmentalized like this, so certain psychological tendencies on the right versus certain psychological tendencies on the left, is because there needs to be the capacity for contradictory behaviors. For example, our brains have a system which tells us to flee whenever we encounter danger, and a system which tells us to fight. Now, these are obviously contradictory things, but we need to have both functions because in different situations, different things may be appropriate. And of course, the best way to do this is to compartmentalize. So put all of the functions that are related to each other on one side, and all of the functions that are distinct from that on the other side, so that there's less of a chance that they'll interfere with each other. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that they will never interfere with each other, but it kind of reduces the likelihood that they will. And this explains how men and women can be composed of contradictory natures. And it's also the fact that the distinction between masculine and feminine is not that concrete, because we're both composed of both systems. But these systems are fundamentally kept separate from each other, which is why we can talk about there being a masculine side of the psyche and a feminine side of the psyche. And so what I'm arguing is that a drive which can be fundamentally characterized as masculine arises from the left hemisphere, and a drive that can be fundamentally characterized as feminine arises from the right hemisphere. I hope I said that right. Now, if we discuss Eros and Logos, we can also see that this is reflected in the right and left hemispheres. This is one of the big differences between the right and left hemispheres. The right hemisphere, in both its structure and function, is the hemisphere of connection. It sees relatedness between things and connection between things. It dissolves boundaries rather than puts boundaries up. And the left hemisphere, again, is the hemisphere of division, of dividing the world into discrete parts and placing things into discrete categories. Eros is actually very closely associated with empathy, because it seems that our emotions themselves allow us to kind of build connections and allow the boundaries between things that we ordinarily place using our logos to dissolve. And this kind of connecting principle, it operates in our minds to connect ideas in our minds, and that's how you can kind of feel a sense of connection between unrelated concepts. It's the right hemisphere that's fundamentally building those connections and seeing the similarities between things. But this ability to see similarities isn't just a mental thing, it's also a social thing. Empathy is itself an attempt to connect with another person. And this is actually why we use the feminine side of our psyches in social settings, because it allows us to be calmer and chiller and more friendly. Likewise, we also use the masculine side when we want to be more independent, when we want to assert ourselves rather than cooperating with other people. When we want to separate ourselves from other people and view ourselves as distinct from them, and be more individualistic, the left hemisphere is more involved, particularly with respect to anger, and that that aggressive drive. You may have sometimes heard of the anima as the relating function, because that's exactly what it does. It attempts to relate, it attempts to empathize. But the animus does the opposite. It doesn't want to relate, it wants to create distinctions. And so the anima pulls people together while their animuses drive them apart. You could say that the animus is like the opposite of the relating function. It's like the distinction function, perhaps. Now, a question you may ask at this point, which I'm going to get to, is how is this masculine drive related to consciousness? And again, the picture here is quite complicated. I tried to demonstrate in that earlier lecture how both hemispheres are fundamentally involved in the experience of consciousness, but there is a sense in which the left hemisphere is predominant in our experience of consciousness, particularly the fact that the left hemisphere is involved in the formation of the ego, as well as our ability to hold ideas in mind and make them explicit. The left hemisphere is the hemisphere of explicitness, and consciousness is a sense of explicitness. When we explicitly know something, it means that our attention is focused on it, and that focused attention is a function of the left hemisphere. It's good at narrowing our attentional window, and that narrowing is very important to be conscious of anything, because we can only be conscious of a few things at any given time, and so being conscious of anything necessarily involves narrowing our focus on a very particular image that we're holding in mind. Now, it's important to note that Jung painted a slightly different picture in Ion, and I think that this idea was a bit underdeveloped, but basically he says that the logos in a woman is her unconscious. Her unconscious is characterized by a logos nature. And I don't think that's the case. I think logos is fundamentally, in both genders, associated with consciousness, and eros is associated with the unconscious in both genders. That is to say that masculinity in both genders gives rise to consciousness, whereas femininity is more closely associated with the unconscious. Now, actually, Jung says this in a later essay, where he says that in women, he being like this, the masculine image that often appears in women's dreams, he corresponds to the so-called positive animus, who indicates the possibility of conscious spiritual effort. And what he's basically saying there is that in woman, that masculine side is associated with the ability to be very willful and to put a lot of effort into something, and to push ourselves towards a very deliberate goal, which requires a great degree of willpower. He says that in women, it's their masculine side which enables them to do this, and I think it's the same thing in men. And so I think this is where the idea makes a lot more sense. And you'll notice that a lot in Jung's writings, that he'll say something in an earlier work that gets contradicted in a later work because he was still kind of developing his ideas. But it's very well captured in this book by Erich Neumann, that the masculine side is associated with consciousness. And I think Erich Neumann's argument makes a lot more sense. But I guess one of the things that characterizes the ego is that the ego is an attempt to create a boundary between I and me and everything that isn't I. The ego is that boundary, is that dividing line. So it isn't in and of itself a kind of boundary which the left hemisphere creates around the concept of I, and then everything that falls outside that concept is viewed as not I. And so the formation of the ego is highly dependent on our ability to create barriers between things. Whereas before you had an ego, it didn't feel as though there was a separation between you and other people. But the ego comes and the left hemisphere comes and creates that boundary, which creates the sense of I-ness, of me being an individual person amidst other people. There's also another fact about the ego which naturally associates it with the masculine side, and that's the fact that in human societies, males tend to be the leaders and tend to be the authoritative voices. In other words, we recall how I said earlier that we have the concepts of masculine and feminine inside our psyches. It also seems to be the case that we naturally associate authority with masculinity, because again, in human societies, older men tend to be the ones who exert their willpower over us. But interestingly enough, even though we perceive men in the outer world as being the ones who with authoritative voices, the ego itself is also a kind of authoritative voice which commands the psyche what to do. So in a societal sense, you can see that men are the leaders. Well, in a psychological sense, the male side of your psyche is also the leader. Your ego, it acts like this authoritative voice which commands the rest of the psyche in order to direct your willpower in a very specific way, and it allows you to accomplish very specific goals. For instance, if you want to learn how to play an instrument, you're using your masculine side to force the rest of yourself to do that difficult thing. And that's why, again, it's very closely associated with masculinity, because it's playing a fundamentally masculine role within the psyche itself. It's like the captain. The ego is like the captain of your psychic ship, and the rest of your psyche perceives it as like almost like this authoritative male figure who it has to listen to. Furthermore, aggression is what allows the ego to combat the unconscious and pull away from it. The hero's myth is, the hero is always depicted as like this masculine figure, and the reason for that is because aggression and the aggressive drive is what allows the kind of individuation of the ego, and the ego's ability to kind of assert its own will and go its own way is highly related to our aggressive drives. Aggression can be used in the process of individuation and in the process of becoming your own person, and furthermore in the process of directing your psyche towards very specific goals that you want to accomplish, which may otherwise be difficult. And this is how it is able to kind of shut the entire world out and narrowly focus, as well as to push the body beyond its emotions. The left side is very good at cutting through emotions, and the ego needs to be able to do that in order to kind of escape the snare of the unconscious and of emotionality. The ego tries to assert its independence and generally tries to reject collectivity. Because it wants to assert itself, this entails a high degree of egoism. It's literally in the name. But again, the capacity of the left hemisphere to very narrowly focus gives the ego its ability to do something with a very determined will. Because it involves it shutting everything out and very narrowly focusing on a few specific things so that these tasks can be completed at the expense of other things. And that involves, again, the ability to make things explicit. Now, again, I explained how anytime we're conscious of anything, the feminine is also playing a role in kind of connecting what we're conscious with to all of the unconscious association that's related to. So I'll explain that in a little bit because it's actually very important. It's a very important function of the anima. So hopefully it's clear why the left side and why masculinity is associated with consciousness. The next question becomes, why is femininity associated with the unconscious? Now, this association is a lot looser. It probably has to do with the polarity between masculine and feminine, which naturally becomes the polarity of consciousness and unconscious. But the feminine side of the psyche and the anima actually facilitates our access to the unconscious. Our access to the unconscious uses the feminine side of the psyche and uses arrows to connect things, and that's how we are able to connect with the unconscious psyche. The feminine side of the psyche, the anima within us, forms a bridge to the unconscious. So it's not necessarily that the entire unconscious is a woman and the entire consciousness is a man. Rather, whenever we access the unconscious, we take a door that is fundamentally feminine. The anima within us is what allows us to connect to the unconscious, which is why it becomes associated with unconsciousness. And there are other associations as well, though, like, for example, passivity and emotionality, those are also associated with the unconscious mind, which, again, gives rise to the fact that we associate femininity with the unconscious mind. And this isn't just like an arbitrary distinction, an arbitrary categorization. In fact, early mythologies often depict masculinity as consciousness and femininity as the unconscious, probably for these very reasons. So even our ancestors implicitly knew to associate these two concepts with each other. These two concepts with their respective psychological concomitants. Masculinity consciousness, femininity unconscious. So again, there's an unconscious masculine drive within us, and this masculine drive pushes up in order to become consciousness. The feminine drive within us instead pushes down to connect us with the unconscious. The feminine is what allows us to break the barrier of the ego and the barriers that consciousness places around the world. It breaks down those things in order to see connections between things. And again, a holistic world isn't something that we understand explicitly. It's something that we understand implicitly, unconsciously, because we can't be conscious of the entire world. And so consciousness, our understanding of a very complicated thing, depends on our unconscious minds rather than our conscious minds. And another way we can kind of see this is the fact that the ego is always struggling against the world. It kind of wants to subvert the world, whereas the feminine side is more chill and go with the flow. It goes with the flow of the universe rather than always struggling against it. The best metaphor that I use to kind of characterize masculine energy and feminine energy is that, like, masculine energy is like attempting to swim against the current of a river, while feminine energy is going with the flow of the current. One is always fighting against the world, whereas the other is kind of going with the world, with the direction of the world, and is more passive in that sense. Women are better in tune with their unconscious minds, which is why they're more emotional, more empathetic. But again, it's not as though consciousness is a man and the unconscious is a woman, because again, the unconscious is such a large part of the psyche that it would be weird to characterize the whole thing as unconscious. Again, there's a masculine drive within us which is fundamentally unconscious, which rises up to become consciousness. There's an unconscious drive within us which is fundamentally feminine, but it's oriented the other way. It doesn't rise up towards consciousness, rather it sinks down into the unconscious in order to connect ideas in the unconscious. So yeah, I hope I made the case well enough. There's a lot of details and things that I can elaborate upon further if you wish. But for now, I'm tired, so I'm gonna go. Thank you for watching. If you have any suggestions for what I should discuss, if you have any questions about this material, I can definitely discuss it in a lot more detail. The reason I discuss all of this is because it's actually very useful knowledge to have, to know about the psyche and how it operates, especially to know about the other side of your psyche. Men often neglect their feminine sides, and women often neglect their masculine sides, but these things can be utilized in very effective ways to live a more productive and balanced life. That's why I discuss them, and that's why I attempt to kind of, build maps of the psyche and relate them to the brain itself. Now, again, there's so many complexities and so many nuances that I left out. For instance, you could even argue that it's not the entire right hemisphere that's the anima, but rather the right hemisphere, the lower regions of the right hemisphere interacting with the lower regions of the left hemisphere. So again, a lot of nuances involved, but I think I'm going to leave it there because I think I've painted an accurate enough picture, which is hopefully cohesive enough that that was interesting. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Thank you. If you feel like subscribing and you haven't subscribed to the channel, I'd really appreciate it. But anyways, thank you. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.